Germany flew first. America got the patent. Britain got the credit. Hook. There's a man you have almost certainly never heard of. His name is not in the history books most people were handed in school. His face is not on any currency. There is no famous statue of him in a public square, no Hollywood film telling his story, no moment in a classroom where a teacher stopped mid-sentence and said, "This man, this is the one you need to remember." And yet, every single airplane flying in the sky today, every commercial jet crossing the Atlantic, every fighter aircraft banking over a desert, every cargo plane threading through the clouds above you right now, exists because of what this one man built. In a leaking shed, with borrowed money, while his own government told him, repeatedly and in writing, that his idea was worthless. His name was Frank Whittle. He invented the jet engine. Germany flew first. America got his blueprints without asking him. Britain took his company. And when it was all over, when the jet age had remade the world and every airline on Earth was flying on his technology, Britain gave him a check for £100,000, pinned a knighthood on his chest, and considered the matter closed. Frank Whittle moved to America. Not temporarily, not for work. He moved to America, became a resident, and never came back. That single fact, that the man who gave Britain the jet engine died 5,000 miles from home, tells you almost everything you need to know about how his country treated him. This is his story, the boy from Coventry. Frank Whittle was born on June the 1st, 1907, in Coventry, England. Not into money, not into connections, not into the kind of family that sent its sons to Oxford and put them on a path straight to the top of British institutions. His father, Moses Whittle, was a mechanic, a working man who ran a small machine shop out of a terraced house and understood engines the way poets understand language. It was all instinct, all feel, all the accumulated knowledge of a man who had spent his life with his hands inside machines. Frank grew up inside that world. Oil on the floor, metal shavings on the workbench, the satisfying click of a well-fitted gear, the smell of a working lathe. Before he could read properly, he was taking things apart, not to break them, but to understand them, to hold the pieces separately and ask the question that would define his entire life. Could this be made better? He was slight, small for his age, thin, bookish in a way that could make a working-class boy invisible in 1910s England. Not the kind of child who looked like he was about to change the world. And then, around 1918, when he was about 11 years old, something happened that lodged itself permanently in the deep part of his mind. He watched an aircraft fly. This was still the early era of aviation. Aircraft were extraordinary things. Rattling, fragile, magnificent machines of wood and canvas and wire, barely controllable, so new to the world that crowds still gathered to watch them pass. To an 11-year-old boy standing in a field in Coventry, watching that machine climb and bank against the great English sky, the effect was total. He decided, right then, that this was his world, that he was going to work with aircraft. That was not a question or a wish. It was simply a fact he had discovered about himself, the way you discover the color of your own eyes. The only question was how to get there. He applied to join the Royal Air Force at 15. They turned him down. Too short. The RAF had height requirements, and Frank Whittle, at 15, standing in front of the recruiting officer with everything he had, did not meet them. He tried again. Different name. Same result. He tried a third time. Between that second rejection and the third attempt, he exercised obsessively. He stretched. He did whatever a determined teenager could do to add fractions of an inch to his frame. He grew just enough, by the narrowest of margins, to pass the physical. He made it in. He could have walked away after the first rejection. After the second, most people would have, most people do. He had been told twice, by the very institution he wanted to serve, that he was not good enough. He did not accept that verdict. He tried a third time, under a different name. That refusal, that bone-deep stubbornness, that absolute unwillingness to accept a judgment he knew to be wrong, is the single thread that runs through Frank Whittle's entire life. It is what made him great, and, in the end, it is what made his story so painful. Because the world does not always reward the people who refuse to give up. Sometimes it just wears them down differently. The Thesis No One Read. By 1926, Whittle had proven himself exceptional enough to earn a place at RAF College Cranwell, the most prestigious officer training institution in British aviation. He was 19, working class, in a world that was still brutally sorted by accent and background and the school you had attended. Frank Whittle was an outsider, and he knew it. He worked harder than everyone else because he believed he had to, because he couldn't afford the luxury of coasting. And in 1928, in his final year at Cranwell, he sat down to write his thesis. The subject he chose was the future of aircraft design. Most cadets, confronted with that assignment, wrote safe papers, modest proposals, incremental improvements to existing technology, things that wouldn't disturb the senior officers who reviewed them, things that demonstrated diligence without threatening the established order. Whittle did not do that. His argument was this: propeller-driven aircraft have a hard, inescapable ceiling. The faster you try to push a propeller through air, the less efficient it becomes. The blade tips approach the speed of sound. Drag increases dramatically, and beyond a certain threshold, more power simply stops producing more speed. At higher altitudes, where the air is thin and cold, the problem compounds. Propellers are inherently limited. If you want to fly truly fast, genuinely fast at high altitude with real military usefulness, you need a completely different kind of engine. He proposed a gas turbine, an engine that would draw in air through an intake, compress it mechanically, mix it with fuel, ignite the mixture in a combustion chamber, and expel the burning gases backward through a nozzle at enormous velocity, pushing the aircraft forward through pure reaction. Newton's third law made industrial. A jet engine. In 1928, written by a 21-year-old cadet from Coventry whose father fixed machines for a living. His professors were impressed. Genuinely, specifically impressed. The paper was exceptional, far beyond anything the assignment required. They encouraged him to develop the concept further, to take it to the people who could act on it. So he did. He formally presented the concept to the Air Ministry of Great Britain. Their response arrived promptly. Technically impractical. 3 words. The considered verdict of the British establishment on the technology that would come to define the entire second half of the 20th century, reshape global warfare, create the modern airline industry, and connect every city on Earth to every other city on Earth. Technically impractical. Whittle applied for a patent anyway in January 1930. He owned, on paper, the intellectual foundation of the jet engine. He had the document. He had the idea. He had the calculations. What he did not have was money, support, or an institution willing to back him. The Air Ministry declined to fund development. Private investors were not interested. The patent sat and used, growing dusty, as the 1930s began and the world moved steadily toward the war that was coming. Then, in 1935, the patent came up for renewal. The renewal fee was £5. Frank Whittle did not have £5. He let the patent lapse. £5, less than the cost of a decent dinner in London, the price of a few books, a sum that a middle-class clerk would not think twice about. Frank Whittle did not have it. And so the technology entered the public domain. His technology, the concept he had developed alone, the idea the Air Ministry had called worthless, was now available to anyone in the world who wanted to build on it. And somewhere in Germany, a young physicist named Hans von Ohain was starting to ask very similar questions about the future of flight. But we will get to him. The shed in Rugby. In the spring of 1935, Frank Whittle's luck changed. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just enough. Two former RAF officers, a man named Rolf Dudley Williams and another named James Tinling, had heard about Whittle's jet engine concept, and unlike nearly everyone else who had heard about it, they believed in it. They connected him with a small investment firm called O.T. Falk and Partners. Together, with great difficulty and very little money, they assembled enough capital to form a company. They called it Power Jets Limited. It was not an impressive company. Its workshop was a rented shed inside the premises of a firm called British Thomson Houston and Rugby, a leaking, drafty industrial space with second-hand equipment and no proper laboratory facilities. Its entire team could fit comfortably around a single table. Its budget was barely enough to operate week to week, but it existed. For the first time in 7 years of fighting against indifference and rejection, Frank Whittle had a place to work and people who believed in what he was doing. He called his prototype the Whittle Unit, the W. He and his small team built it by hand, solving problems as they went, problems that had never been solved before because no one had ever built anything like this before. Every component was either custom-made or adapted from existing industrial machinery in ways that had never been tried. On April 12, 1937, they were ready to run it. Whittle's team gathered in the shed. Everyone understood the weight of the moment, or at least what it could mean if the engine actually worked. The W sat on its test stand. Instruments were connected. The ignition sequence was prepared. Whittle started the engine. For a moment, nothing. Then the engine caught, and then it screamed. Not a hum, not a controlled idle. A rising, violent, terrifying scream, a sound unlike anything any of them had heard before, that shook the walls of the shed, rattled the windows, and sent two men diving for the door. The engine was accelerating beyond its designed operating speed. The throttle was not responding normally. The fuel was feeding the fire, and the fire was growing, and the needle on the tachometer was climbing past the red line, and for several long, terrible seconds nobody could tell whether the engine was going to hold together, or tear itself and everyone in the shed apart. Then it steadied. The scream dropped to a roar. The roar settled into a sustained, powerful, extraordinary hum that filled the shed and vibrated through the floor and through the bones of everyone standing there. The engine was running. Frank Whittle stood in that leaking shed in Rugby and listened to a sound the world had never heard before. The sound of the future he had imagined in a college thesis 9 years earlier. Now real, now undeniable, now impossible to dismiss with 3 words on a government memorandum. His reaction, later, was characteristic. He pulled out his notebook and started writing down what needed to be improved for the next version. That is Frank Whittle. But while he was writing in that notebook, while his team was standing around the test stand in stunned, exhausted silence, something was happening in Germany that none of them knew about. The German shadow. His name was Hans von Ohain. He was born in 1911, 4 years younger than Whittle. He had a doctorate in physics from the University of Göttingen, one of the great scientific institutions of Europe. And he had, entirely independently of Frank Whittle and with no knowledge of the Cranwell thesis or the Power Jets shed, arrived at the same destination by a different road. Ohain had begun thinking about jet propulsion in the early 1930s. He found the concept of propellers, like Whittle, to be fundamentally limited, elegant but bounded. He believed a continuous cycle jet engine could fly higher, faster, more efficiently. He began developing his own designs. Then, in 1936, he did something that Frank Whittle had been unable to do. He found the right patron, Ohain approached Ernst Heinkel, one of Germany's most ambitious, most aggressive, most technically progressive aircraft manufacturers. A man who understood that aviation was changing and wanted to be at the front of that change, not watching it from a distance. Heinkel listened to Ohain explain the concept. He asked a few questions. He thought about it. Then he gave Ohain money, engineers, proper laboratory facilities, and a clear, simple mandate. Build it. No rejection letters. No committees reviewing the proposal and finding it impractical. No renewal fees that couldn't be paid. No government bureaucrats inserting themselves between the inventor and his work. Just build it. Ohain built it. By the summer of 1939, the Heinkel He-178 was ready. A small, sleek, experimental aircraft with Ohain's engine mounted in its fuselage. On the morning of August the 27th, 1939, test pilot Erich Warsitz climbed into the cockpit at the Heinkel airfield at Rostock-Marigny, opened the throttle, accelerated down the runway, and lifted off. The world's first jet-powered aircraft flight in history. 5 days later, Germany invaded Poland. World War II had begun. Think about what that means for a moment. Britain had the idea first. Frank Whittle had written the thesis in 1928. He had the patent in 1930. He had his engine running on a test stand in 1937. And Germany flew first. Not by a few weeks. Not in some photo finish race where both sides were neck and neck to the end. Britain was so far behind that the most destructive war in human history had already started before a British jet aircraft had ever left the ground. The Air Ministry, the same office that had written technically impractical on Whittle's proposal a decade earlier, was now sitting in London, reading intelligence reports about a German jet aircraft and confronting the full, humiliating consequence of its own failure. They had a choice to make. They could continue to dismiss Whittle, continue to manage him at arm's length, to underfund him, to treat his work as a curiosity rather than a priority. Or they could admit, quietly, without ceremony, without any acknowledgement of the decade they had wasted, that a working-class mechanic's son from Coventry had been right all along. They chose to admit it. Quietly, without apology, without the basic decency of looking Frank Whittle in the eye and saying the words he had earned the right to hear. They simply started providing funding, as though that was sufficient, as though money, arriving 10 years too late, could simply erase what had been lost. Britain wakes up, with government money finally flowing. The pace of development accelerated sharply. The Gloucester Aircraft Company was contracted to build an experimental aircraft around Whittle's engine. The aircraft was designated the E.28/39, a single-engine, clean-line jet with a pressurized cockpit and a design that was, for its time, extraordinary. But even as the engineering advanced, something else was happening inside Power Jets Limited, something quieter and more corrosive. The government's money came with government oversight, and government oversight meant officials, men who attended meetings and produced reports and, gradually, inserted themselves into decisions that had previously been made by Whittle and his team. The small, loyal group of engineers who had built the engine from nothing, who had believed in it when no institution would, found themselves increasingly having to justify themselves to people who had not been there from the beginning and did not fully understand what they were overseeing. Whittle fought it. He wrote memos, raised objections, argued in meetings, pushed back against every attempt to dilute the technical authority of his core team. He was direct to the point of bluntness and stubborn to the point of inflexibility, and in the bureaucratic world that was now enclosing him, these qualities, the same qualities that had built the engine in the first place, were now being treated as problems. He was also burning himself out. The sleepless nights had begun years earlier and never really stopped. He was chain-smoking 40, 50 cigarettes a day. He was taking benzodrine, an amphetamine that was, at the time, a legal and commonly prescribed stimulant for people working under extraordinary pressure. It kept him going. It also quietly accumulated damage that would not become visible until later. And then came May the 15th, 1941, the day the Gloucester E.28 of 39 flew. The test took place at RAF Cranwell. RAF Cranwell, the same airfield where Frank Whittle had studied as a cadet, where he had sat at a desk and written the thesis that the world had ignored, where his story had begun 13 years earlier, with a 19-year-old boy who refused to accept the limits the system wanted to place on him. He stood on the grass and watched. Test pilot flight Lieutenant Philip Sayer climbed into the cockpit. The engine, Whittle's engine, the direct descendant of the machine that had screamed in the Rugby shed 4 years before, spun up. The aircraft rolled down the runway, accelerated, and lifted. Clean, fussed, quiet compared to anything that had taken off from that airfield before. Climbing into the English sky with a sound unlike anything heard over Cranwell in all its history. Whittle watched it go. When people asked him later what that moment felt like, the validation of 13 years of work, of 3 rejection letters, of a £5 patent fee he couldn't pay, of the shed and the screaming engine and the breakdown that was still coming, he was, as always, understated. He said he was glad it worked. 13 years. And his reaction was, I was glad it worked. But the story was not over. It was barely halfway. Because while Frank Whittle was standing on that runway, watching his dream finally leave the ground, a decision was already being made in London. A decision nobody had told him about. The American gift. In the summer of 1941, the British government decided to give Frank Whittle's jet engine technology to the United States of America. America was not yet in the war. Pearl Harbor was still 5 months away. The United States was neutral, officially uninvolved, watching Europe from a careful distance, providing material support to Britain under the Lend-Lease program, but not yet a combatant. Britain needed America, desperately, needed American industry, needed American resources, needed the certainty of eventual American entry into the conflict. And in the currency of wartime alliance building, jet engine technology was something Britain possessed and America did not. So they gave it. A Whittle engine was crated up and shipped across the Atlantic Ocean to the General Electric Company facility in Lynn, Massachusetts. American engineers were given complete, unrestricted access to everything: the design, the technical drawings, the calculations, the solutions to every problem that Whittle's team had spent years solving through painful trial and error. Frank Whittle found out after it had already happened. He was not consulted. He was not asked for his assessment of the decision. He was not even informed in advance. He was told what had been done by the men who had done it as a fact he needed to be aware of. He was a serving officer. Insubordination was not an option. Formal protest had hard limits. He accepted it, the way he had learned to accept the things that were done to him, outwardly, professionally, while carrying the weight of it privately. From General Electric's work on the Whittle engine came the Bell XP 59 Aerocomet, America's first jet aircraft, which flew in October 1942. From that foundation grew everything. The entire post-war American jet program. The F-86 Sabre that flew in Korea. The Boeing 707 that created the modern commercial aviation industry. Every American military jet, every American airliner, every piece of the extraordinary mid-century aerospace dominance that the United States built for itself in the decades after the war. All of it traces back, in a direct and unbroken line, to the engine Frank Whittle built in a leaking shed in Rugby, to the engine his government had called technically impractical. Meanwhile, back in Britain, the Gloucester Meteor, the first operational British jet fighter, entered service with the RAF in 1944. It was the only Allied jet aircraft to see active combat in World War II. It never met a German jet in air-to-air battle, as fate arranged things. But it flew over the English countryside, intercepting V-1 flying bombs, the German pulse-jet cruise missiles that were raining down on London and the surrounding counties, killing civilians by the hundreds. The meteor was fast enough to catch them, agile enough to tip them off course or destroy them before they reached their targets. Frank Whittle's engine, flying over Britain, protecting the people who had spent a decade ignoring the man who built it. Then something happened that undid what little was left of Frank Whittle. The Nationalization and the Breakdown. In early 1944, the British government nationalized Power Jets Limited. They absorbed it into a state-controlled body, renamed it, and restructured its operations. The stated rationale was straightforward. This technology was now too important, too strategically significant, too central to the future of British aviation to remain in private hands. And that was true. But the same government that declared the technology too important for private control had spent nearly a decade declaring it too unimportant to fund. The same institution that was now absorbing Power Jets Limited had written technically impractical on Frank Whittle's proposal in 1929, had let his patent lapse for one of £5, had given his life's work to a foreign power without asking him. And now they were taking the company. Whittle and his core team, the loyal, exceptional engineers who had built something from nothing, who had believed in the engine before anyone else would, were effectively pushed aside. Not fired, not arrested, just made irrelevant by institutional restructuring, by the slow, bureaucratic process of taking what someone else built and absorbing it until the original builders no longer fit. Whittle protested. He wrote letters. He made the case, with characteristic directness, that the people who actually understood the technology should be the ones developing it further. He lost. By 1945, he was coming apart. He was 38 years old. He had been working at a pace and intensity that no human body was designed to sustain for close to a decade. The benzodrine that had kept him functional was now working against him. The accumulated neurological effect of years of amphetamine use, combined with the physical toll of almost no sleep, combined with the psychological pressure of watching the institution take what he had built, had pushed him past a threshold he could not step back from. He had a breakdown, a full clinical collapse. He was hospitalized and removed from active work. The man who had invented the jet engine, who had changed the future of aviation, who had fought the British establishment for 15 years and somehow kept winning on the technical merits, even while losing every institutional battle, was in a hospital bed, unable to function. History is crowded with stories about what institutions do to the people who threaten them. First, they ignore them. Then they use them. Then they take from them. Frank Whittle's story follows that pattern so precisely it is almost like a template. He recovered. He returned to work. He endured. But the essential connection between Frank Whittle and his country, the belief, however embattled, that Britain would eventually recognize what he had done and treat him with something approaching justice, had been quietly broken. In 1948, a royal commission assembled to determine the appropriate compensation for the inventor of the jet engine. After due deliberation, they arrived at a number, £100,000, for the technology that had already transformed Allied aviation, that had been handed to the United States and was now reshaping American industry. That would generate hundreds of billions of pounds in economic value over the following half-century. That was, at that very moment, being developed by Rolls-Royce and Havilland and the great post-war British aerospace industry, an industry built entirely on foundations that Frank Whittle had laid. £100,000. and a knighthood, Sir Frank Whittle, awarded the same year. He accepted both. He retired from the Royal Air Force that same year, 1948. He was 41 years old, in poor health, exhausted in a way that went deeper than sleep could reach. He spent the following years writing, consulting, being celebrated at events organized by people who had once worked hard to exclude him. The aviation world, the world he had created, slowly came to understand the scale of what he had done. Awards accumulated, honorary degrees, fellowships, tributes. He accepted them graciously, and he moved steadily and with quiet deliberateness, further from Britain and closer to America. Whittle and Ohain. Here is the part of this story I keep coming back to. After the war ended, Hans von Ohain, the German physicist whose engine had flown first, who had done for the Nazis what Whittle had done for Britain, also ended up in the United States. He was brought over as part of Operation Paperclip, the American program that recruited German scientists and engineers after the war, reasoning that their expertise was too valuable to leave in a defeated, occupied country. Ohain went to work for the U.S. Air Force Research Laboratory at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. He became an American citizen. He built a long and distinguished career in American aerospace research. And at some point in the 1960s, Frank Whittle and Hans von Ohain met for the first time. Think carefully about what that meeting represented. One man had built the jet engine for Britain. The other had built it for Germany. Between them and the war they had each served, tens of millions of people had died. They had been on opposite sides of the most catastrophic conflict in human history. Their inventions had changed the course of that war, and the world that had emerged from the wreckage was shaped, in part, by the engines they had each built in secrecy, in competition, in separate countries that were trying to destroy each other. And now they were standing in the same room. Two old engineers, both living in America, both shaped by the same obsession with making aircraft go faster, both marked by the experience of building something extraordinary and then watching institutions take it from them. They became friends, not a cautious, formal, professionally correct friendship, genuine warmth. They gave lectures together. They corresponded. They expressed for each other the kind of deep, uncomplicated mutual respect that can only exist between two people who have pursued the same impossible thing and both, somehow, achieved it. In 1991, they were jointly awarded the Charles Stark Draper Prize, one of the highest honors in engineering, sometimes called the Nobel Prize of Technology. They stood together on the stage to receive it. There is a photograph from that period. They are laughing. I have thought about that photograph a long time. The man who built the engine for the Allies and the man who built it for the Nazis, both living in America, both laughing. What does that mean? I think it means this. The institutions, the governments, the ministries, the procurement offices, the committees had used both of them, had taken for both of them, had shaped their work to serve national purposes that neither of them had fully chosen. And in the end, both of them had ended up in the same country, celebrated by a nation that had not been theirs at birth, finding in each other a companionship that their own countries had never quite offered. And Whittle chose that friendship. He chose not to carry the bitterness that his story almost certainly entitled him to. He had been rejected, dismissed, underfunded, used, nationalized, compensated inadequately, and ultimately exiled. Not by force, but by the accumulated weight of a country that had never fully known what to do with him. He had every reason to end his life as an angry man. Instead, he ended it laughing with his German counterpart in an American auditorium. That choice, the choice of generosity over grievance, is more remarkable than the engine. Hans von Ohain died on March the 13th, 1998. Frank Whittle died 2 years before him. August the 9th, 1996. 89 years old, Columbia, Maryland. What this means: there is a pattern in stories like Frank Whittle's and is not unique to him. It appears across centuries, across cultures, across fields of human endeavor. The pattern is this. First, dismissal. The idea is impractical, impossible, not worth pursuing. The person is too young, too low-born, too outside the establishment, too threatening to the existing order to be taken seriously. The rejection arrives on official letterhead and uses reasonable, measured language. Then, reluctant acknowledgement, usually forced by external competition, in Whittle's case, by Germany flying first. The establishment admits that the idea has merit. It does not admit that it was wrong. It simply moves on, as though the decade of failure never happened, as though the man who was right all along should be grateful that the people who were wrong are now willing to work with him. Then, appropriation. The idea is now too important to be left in the hands of the person who created it. Resources flow in, but control flows out. The inventor is slowly, methodically separated from the invention. The company is nationalized. The technology is shared with foreign powers. The original team is dispersed. What was built by specific, irreplaceable individuals is absorbed into an institution that will eventually claim it as its own. Then, compensation. A check, a title, an official ceremony at which the debt is declared settled. And then silence. The establishment keeps the prize. The inventor is left to make peace with what happened, as best they can, for the rest of their life. Frank Whittle made that peace. That is his final act of courage, and perhaps his greatest. But the lesson does not change because the man was gracious. Institutions are not built to recognize genius. They are built to manage it, absorb it, and eventually own it. They reward compliance and punish disruption, even when the disruption is right, especially when it is right. The only reason the jet engine exists at all is because Frank Whittle was more stubborn than the system was patient. He applied 3 times. He wrote the patent they refused to fund. He built the engine they called impossible. He watched Germany fly first because they wouldn't listen, watched his technology cross the Atlantic without his permission, watched his company disappear into the state. And through all of it, he kept building. Not for Britain, not for the RAF, not for the government that had failed him at every step. For the engine. Because the engine was real, and real things cannot be dismissed. Closing. In the last years of his life, Frank Whittle lived quietly in Columbia, Maryland. He was a fellow at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis. He gave lectures. He answered correspondence. He received visitors, engineers, historians, young students who had read about him and wanted to meet the man who had changed the shape of the sky. He was modest with all of them. He deflected praise. He talked about the problems he had not solved as readily as the ones he had. People who met him at the end of his life speak of a man who was genuinely at peace. He had found, in America, what England had never quite given him. Not fame exactly, not wealth, just the feeling of being in a place that appreciated what he had done without needing to apologize for having once failed to appreciate it. In Columbia, Maryland, the sky is busy. The airport corridors of the East Coast thread overhead, planes climbing out of Washington, descending into Baltimore, crossing between New York and the South. On clear days you can hear them. The distant, sustained rumble of jet engines crossing the sky at altitude. Frank Whittle's engines. Every one of them tracing their design back to a college thesis that a government called impractical, to a patent that lapsed for £5, to a leaking shed in Rugby where a man and a handful of engineers built the future by hand, to a test stand on April the 12th, 1937, When an engine screamed to life in a drafty industrial shed and changed everything, and the man who built it reached for his notebook to write down what still needed to be improved. He died on August the 9th, 1996. 89 years old, a knight of the British Empire, winner of the Draper Prize, honorary fellow of more institutions than he could easily remember, celebrated, finally, by the world he had remade. He died in Maryland, not England, America. Every time a plane lifts off, anywhere in the world, in any weather, on any airline, in any country, Frank Whittle is in the engine. He just couldn't stay in England. If this story stayed with you, there's one small thing you can do right now that costs nothing and means everything for a channel like this one. Hit subscribe. Leave a comment telling me which part of Frank Whittle's story surprised you most, because I read every single one. And share this with someone who loves history. Because the people who changed the world deserve to be remembered, even the ones their own countries forgot.